coming soon. Two Christians, two books, two perspectives, all concerning themselves about Christians and these. Coming soon on Here's What's Missing. I'd hoped to have a video ready on this topic this weekend, but unfortunately I am still behind on my reading, so I'm going to kick that can down the road a little bit. In the meantime, I'm going to address this thing that came up during the midterms.
Did you know it's easier to get a gun than to vote?
This was written by a guy who obviously has never bought a gun in his life, with the usual gaps in his knowledge on the subject. And here's what's missing.
Well, baby, I'm easy, I'm easy, I'm easy, I'm an easy man.
Now, assuming you're doing this legally and officially, in order to get a gun, you need to be physically present. With voting, you can turn in an absentee ballot, although that proved to be a rather difficult procedure for some millennials. In order to get a gun, you have to present a form of valid photo ID. Only 7 states in this country require that to vote. Fill out a federal form known as 4473, certifying that you are qualified to buy a gun, meaning that you are a legal resident, you are not a felon, you are not abusing controlled substances, and you are mentally fit to own a gun. You don't have to fill out such a form when you're voting, and many of the things that can disqualify you from buying a gun will not necessarily disqualify you from voting. Legal residency. Current federal law forbids non-resident aliens from possessing firearms. And the same is kind of true for voting, although there's a push on the political left to loosen this up, especially at the local level. Mentally unfit. In 39 states, a judge can strip a person of voting rights on account of mental incompetence. Now, the left tends to resist this, believing that it slaps a stigma on a person. However, they're not as willing to do that for guns. Abusing controlled substances is a surefire way of disqualifying you from owning a gun. However, it's definitely not a disqualifying factor for voting. Felony record, it will keep you from getting a gun, but will not necessarily keep you from voting. In fact, in some states, felons can vote while in prison, although most allow it only after they've been released, after they've fulfilled parole, or after they're done with probation. Which brings us to the next requirement. Background checks. You see, after you're done filling out Form 4473 and answering the questions we just went over, plus giving your name, date of birth, social security number, and what you're buying, then you hand all this over to the FFL, who dials up the NIC system and reads off everything that you filled out that form with, and then waits to see if it's okay for you to buy the gun or not. Last time I went voting, I didn't need to subject myself to a background check, much less tell someone else who it was I was voting for before I actually cast my ballot. Plus, if you pass, you actually have to pay for the gun itself, plus any applicable transfer fees, every single time you buy a gun. I've never had to pay anything to vote. Also bear in mind that there are limitations on the kinds of guns that you can buy. And this varies from state to state, but on a federal level, machine guns are largely prohibited, although there are some you still can buy. They're just very rare, very expensive, and it requires like a $200 machine gun tax plus several months of waiting time before you can get your hands on it. Also, there are other kind of guns like short-barreled rifles that require a $200 stamp tax, more background checks, and you have to wait several months for them too. So imagine, if you would, if the powers that be felt that you were only responsible enough to handle local and state elections, but for the really serious elections on the federal level, you had to pay a $200 tax and wait several months before you could vote. Or for the really big one, the presidential election, it was only limited to an elite few who could afford it.
Oh yeah? What about gun shows?
Now, licensed gun vendors at gun shows also follow federal procedures, including filling out Form 4473 and performing an instant background check. Now, private sales between private citizens is a private affair and requires no more federal scrutiny than co-workers getting together to decide what to have for lunch.
Lunch never killed anybody.
Maybe not per se, but obesity kills more people in this country per year than guns do. At least twice per year, maybe even as many as 8 times. But getting back to gun shows, criminals aren't as interested in getting their guns from gun shows as gun control advocates would like to think. A University of Chicago survey that was conducted sometime last year interviewed incarcerated criminals and discovered that most of them tended to avoid gun shows out of fear of getting caught. But this just confirms a National Institute of Justice study from the 1990s that said pretty much the same thing. In other words, this has been known for decades, but hasn't been promoted in gun control circles. Why? Is it better for gun control to push for policy based on falsehoods? Is the demand that the state be the sole provider for personal security so appealing that they are willing to marginalize one civil right to get it and thereby set precedent to do away with all the others? This is a danger identified by Alan Dershowitz, who is hardly a right-winger and definitely no fan of gun rights. But nonetheless, he said, "Foolish liberals who are trying to read the Second Amendment out of the Constitution by claiming it's not an individual right or that it's too much of a safety hazard don't see the danger of the big picture. They're courting disaster by encouraging others to use this same means to eliminate portions of the Constitution they don't like."